Raven stood in the center of the council ring with her wrists unbound and still felt shackled, because every elder in Blackthorn had already decided what her silence meant before she opened her mouth. Snowmelt ran in thin threads between the flagstones, and moonlight came through the high vents in blades, cutting her face into light and shadow as if even the room could not settle on what she was, packblood or trespasser. Rook waited 3 paces behind her right shoulder in formal witness gray, his expression arranged into grief so polished it looked inherited. Across from him, the king sat with 9 pack standards hanging behind his chair, and he was the only one in that room who had ever asked her permission for anything. She could feel Lachlan Valewood's attention on her like a held breath. He had not spoken since the charges were read, aiding rogue bands, trafficking medical supplies across ward lines, withholding attack routes from Crown patrols. Rook's voice had carried every accusation with wounded sincerity, and Etta Valewood, the King's council aunt, had watched Raven with that exact brand of disappointment reserved for disasters that confirm old beliefs. Raven had heard that tone her whole life. If she had been raised 7 miles inside the boundary stones, they would have called her frightened or stubborn. Raised 7 miles beyond them, she was immediately dangerous. The High Clerk asked the king if he would exercise sovereign override and end proceedings, and the chamber tightened around the question. One word from Lachlan could have dismissed the hearing and sent her home under guard, which would have saved her body and destroyed her name forever. He said no, and the no landed like cold iron. Raven felt her lungs seize because his refusal sounded exactly like abandonment, and abandonment was the language she understood best. The clerk nodded, then called for witness declarations. Raven stared at the floor and thought, "This is where he lets the process bury me." She did not look up until chair legs scraped stone, and the king rose from his seat without being summoned. The council murmured in confusion. Etta's head snapped toward him. Lachlan stepped down into the ring, removed his signet glove, and offered his bare palm to the oath flame that verified truth by blood and scent. He was not supposed to do this. Kings adjudicated. They did not testify. When the flame recognized him and turned silver instead of blue, every whisper died. He looked at Raven first, not the council, and for one dangerous second the room vanished for her, leaving only the memory of snow and boundary stones and a voice that had once asked permission to cross into her life. Then he turned to the elders and said, Rook Shadowfang had provided falsified patrol maps and facilitated rogue passage through old herb routes, and he knew this because his own boundary captain had tracked the route markers to Rook's sealed grain stores that afternoon. Rook lunged toward him before reason caught up to pride. Guards pinned him to the floor in 2 strides. Raven did not move. Lachlan stood in Oathlight and spoke the final name no one had expected him to speak, his own aunt. He stated that Etta's alliance block had pressed for rapid conviction before all evidence was reviewed, because a public scandal around an outsider healer would strengthen their pending bloodline treaty with Stonemere. Etta went white with fury. The chamber erupted. Raven heard none of it clearly, because one thought had cracked open in her like thaw water splitting river ice. If he had wanted convenience, he could have kept his mouth shut. He had chosen the harder road in front of everyone. That was where the story seemed to begin for everyone watching. A king standing against his own counsel for a woman no one inside the line considered worth the trouble. Raven knew the truth sat years earlier, in winter smoke and medicinal roots. In shame she inherited before she could speak. And in the first time she heard the king's voice at the stones and realized power could arrive with restraint. The hearing flame kept burning while memory pulled her backward to where she had learned what survival cost. Raven was born in 2003, 7 miles beyond the Blackthorn boundary, in a cabin built from split cedar and refusal. Her mother, Sable, had been expelled while pregnant under charges sealed by council order, which meant no one was required to explain them, and everyone was free to assume the worst. Beyond the ward stones, law grew thin and winter grew teeth. Sable survived by trading tinctures and fever bark to boundary caravans that stopped short of the stones and pretended not to know who mixed the medicine that kept half their elders breathing through cold months. Raven's earliest memory was not her mother's face. Although she could summon that later, it was the sound of stone markers singing in wind at dusk. Old treaty magic sat in those carved monoliths and reacted to rank, weapons, and intent. Armed alphas were forbidden by custom to cross marked ward stones without verbal leave from the landholder beyond, even if that landholder held no recognized rank. People called it superstition when they wanted to ignore it. People called it sacred when they needed protection. Sable taught her to harvest yarrow in gloves and wolfsbane with iron tongs, then taught her how to keep her eyes lowered when pack officers came too close. Shame traveled faster than weather in Boundary Country. By the time Raven turned 9, she understood that adults inside the line used her last name as a warning. Shadowfang girls were trouble. Shadowfang girls brought scandal. Shadowfang girls were never chosen for anything permanent. Winter fever took Sable in 2015. The illness came in a week of hard wind when supply routes froze, and her cough started red. Raven was 12 and small enough that Sable still called her little wolf in the rare, soft moments, and old enough to understand what happened when a healer became a patient without medicine. Morel Thorne, Sable's older sister, arrived too late to save her, and early enough to keep Raven from being taken by debt collectors who treated orphaned Boundary children as labor collateral. After the burial, Morel took over the cabin and set rules with practical kindness. No crossing the stones after dusk, no trading alone with unknown caravans, no accepting interpack contracts that included the word obedience. She had lost one sister to policy and did not plan to lose a niece to paperwork. Raven learned every herb route between the cabin and the ward line within 6 months, because grief demanded utility, and hunger respected skill more than sorrow. The roots gave Raven a life measured in miles and seasons, never in ceremonies. She treated frostbite, birthing tears, infected bites, and old men who refused to stop working despite failing lungs. Her patients included people from both sides of the line, though no one admitted that publicly, because illness made hypocrites of purists. In those years, she built a reputation that moved quietly through winter markets: boundary-born healer, steady hands, no gossip, fair prices. None of it changed her legal status. She remained outside. By 2024, word of her skill had reached Rook Shadowfang, her older cousin inside Blackthorn. He visited the cabin in polished boots that had never seen true mud and arrived with a contract rolled in red ribbon because humiliation always came dressed as opportunity. He offered Raven conditional re-entry to Pack territory, the document granting her a worker's badge and sleeping cot in the lower infirmary if she signed 10 years of bonded service to the Shadowfang household and surrendered all independent trade rights. Morel read every line in silence. Raven read them twice. The contract called her kin, where convenient, and property, where binding. She handed it back without ceremony. Rook smiled like he had expected refusal, and told her she was choosing exile when grace had been offered. She answered that grace did not usually demand ownership papers. He left with the contract untouched, and the promise that the pack did not forget insults. That conversation resolved one hesitation she had carried since Sable's death. Before that day, she still wondered if there was a dignified path back inside. After that day, she stopped waiting for invitation and built her life around self-governance. 2 years passed. Raven turned 23 in a late winter that came with unusually organized rogue attacks. Not random raids for food, but strikes aimed at patrol schedules, supply depots, and messenger routes. Rumors traveled ahead of injured bodies. Someone had given outsiders internal maps. Crown patrols widened their sweep to the Blackthorn frontier, which meant armed alphas and officers approaching wardstones at all hours, requesting passage, testing custom against urgency. On the last hard freeze of late winter 2026, Raven followed a rabbit track through pine scrub searching for bloodroot and heard wolves running in formation long before she saw them. She moved toward higher ground by instinct. Through the trees, she spotted 6 Crown Scouts in black and silver harness and one man ahead of them, larger, bareheaded despite snow, carrying authority in the way silence arranged itself around him. She recognized him from market carvings and coin profiles. Lachlan Valewood, king over 9 packs, the man people described as disciplined to the point of coldness. He stopped at the boundary stones before the others reached him, and the scouts halted automatically at his back. Ward runes along the stone edges brightened under his proximity. Raven could smell alpha on the wind, old cedar, iron, and winter air before storm. Every instinct she had screamed to stay hidden. He turned his face toward the trees where she stood unseen and said, "Clear enough to carry through snow, landholder beyond Blackthorn line. I request leave to cross and inspect rogue tracks on your side." Raven waited 3 heartbeats to check if this was performance. Men with power often asked for form and took substance. He did not move. Captain Soren Pike, identifiable by boundary insignia on his collar, shifted once as if expecting his king to proceed regardless, and Lachlan lifted one hand without looking back. Soren stilled immediately. The king was waiting on permission from a woman his counsel probably did not count. She stepped out from the trees with dirt on her knees and herb bundles at her belt, and 6 scouts reached for weapons before Soren barked them down. Raven kept her eyes on Lachlan. His gaze took her in and locked for a fraction too long, a flicker she interpreted as calculation because that was safer than hope. She said she would grant leave for 1 mile only, no weapons drawn unless attacked, and no one entered her cabin yard without a second request. He answered, agreed, in that short declarative style that sounded like law and somehow felt like respect. From Lachlan's perspective, in the only moment that mattered before he put the mask back on, the world had narrowed to the scent thread that snapped into focus the instant she stepped into open light. Mate recognition in Old Ward territory often arrived first through scent, sharpened by treaty magic, and this one struck from 7 paces away with the force of remembered hunger. He had spent years disciplining every primal impulse into governance. Recognition did not ask permission from discipline. He kept his voice level and his posture formal because one uncontrolled step would have broken the law he was there to enforce. Raven led the patrol along ridge paths where rogue prints crossed into deer trails, and she expected interrogation. Lachlan asked only practical questions: where tracks split, where smuggled salt was usually cached, which ravine held stable footing in thaw. He listened to her answers without interruption. Each time she reached for a steep descent, he moved slightly downhill first, as if measuring risk lines around her body. She noticed and decided he was maintaining witness protocol for a useful local guide. That interpretation kept her pulse manageable. When they reached the 1-mile point, he stopped on his own and said he would not cross farther without renewed leave. Raven had expected him to test limits once he reached difficult terrain. Instead, he handed her a folded patrol token authorizing safe passage through Crown checkpoints for medical work during active raids. Soren looked startled. Raven took the token with numb fingers and told herself this was strategy, not concern. She needed that belief because the alternative demanded more trust than she had available. That first encounter resolved a practical obstacle she had never been able to move on her own. Before the king asked permission at the stones, any contact with armed patrols risked immediate seizure as trespass. After he honored her leave publicly, she could negotiate with officers as a recognized landholder and move medicine through checkpoints without begging. The shift was procedural, and procedure could change survival. The same week delivered the case that pulled everything tighter. A boundary child named Leo was carried to Raven's cabin at dusk with a trap chain embedded in his thigh and rogue insignia stitched into his coat lining, the kind of symbol used by raiders who sold stolen goods through hidden routes. Morel recognized the stitching pattern from grain sacks Rook's men had purchased in bulk the previous month. Leo's mother was Blackthorn by birth and had fled a violent bond claim years earlier, which meant both territories could argue jurisdiction and avoid responsibility. Raven faced a decision that could have kept her safer if she chose neutrality. She could treat the wound quietly, release the family, and keep the smuggling suspicion private. Instead, she sent Morel to summon Captain Soren and documented every mark on Leo's coat and chain in a healer's ledger with witness signatures from 2 traders. That choice resolved her own neutrality paralysis. Before Leo arrived, she told herself survival depended on staying invisible in other people's crimes. After she filed evidence, she became visible in a way that power would have to answer. Soren arrived near midnight with 4 officers and a face she could not read. He listened while she explained the chain steel origin and route scent traces, then asked if she would provide testimony if the trail reached Inner Pack names. Raven heard the warning under the question. Inner names meant retaliation. She said yes anyway. Soren studied her for a long second and replied he would place her under temporary crown watch until evidence transfer was complete. When he left, 2 officers stayed on the road outside her cabin all night in rotating shifts. By dawn, the rumor was everywhere. Raven Shadowfang had given the crown a thread that pointed inward. Rook came before noon with no formal escort, smiling hard and speaking softly, which was his preferred shape when angry. He told her she had misunderstood trademarks and should issue a correction before she damaged family standing. Raven asked which family, the one that offered servitude contracts, or the one that forged them. His expression flattened. He leaned close enough for her to smell clove oil on his breath and said hearings could be unpleasant for women without legal rank. She replied that threats sounded cheaper when delivered to a healer treating your smugglers. He left without touching her, and that restraint did not reassure her because controlled men planned better revenge than reckless ones. 3 days after her first meeting with Lachlan, a council summons arrived in sealed blue wax, charging her with aiding rogues and falsifying medical records to shield cross-boundary trafficking. Rook had moved first, filed accusations, and forced the court venue onto Blackthorn ground, where his allies held procedural advantage. Morel wanted to burn the summons and run farther north into unclaimed ridges. Raven considered it for exactly 1 minute. Running would keep her free and prove every rumor true. She chose to appear because she had spent 23 years living outside the pack and was tired of letting other people write her record in rooms she never entered. Soren escorted her to the hearing hall under Crown protection, his manner formal and distant, and still he adjusted his pace to hers on icy steps as though small courtesies might hold a person together before judgment. Inside the hall, hierarchy pressed from every angle. Etta Valewood sat to the king's left in blue council robes, her silver hair pinned high, each movement exact. She represented the traditionalist bloc negotiating a bloodline alliance with Stonemere, a treaty that would stabilize 2 border valleys and secure winter grain routes for 5 years. A scandal around Lachlan choosing a boundary-born outsider threatened that treaty before it was signed. Raven did not know the mating politics in detail, yet she felt the pressure like static in air before lightning. Lachlan entered last, and the room changed shape around him. Raven forced herself not to track him, failed, and tracked him anyway. He did not offer private reassurance, did not bend rules in her favor, did not soften procedure. When the clerk asked whether he would invoke sovereign override, he refused, and the refusal sliced through her trust so cleanly she almost did not bleed right away. She had believed his restraint at the Stones meant he would not leave her in hostile process. She discovered restraint could also mean making her endure the process intact. Laughlin's refusal resolved his governance conflict in public view. Before that moment, council critics could claim he was compromised by personal interest and using rank to shield an outsider. After refusing override, he locked the hearing into lawful procedure and removed that excuse, which made any later defense of Raven politically costly instead of convenient. Raven could not see that in real time. She only felt alone. Rook testified first, voice controlled, claiming Raven had supplied poultices and route data to rogue runners for months. He produced ledgers stamped with counterfeit healer seals and named 2 dead smugglers as witnesses. Dead men were useful because they never contradicted paid testimony. Etta allowed the documents into record pending verification, a technical choice that gave accusation the appearance of solidity. Raven answered each charge directly, requested seal forensics, and pointed to chain steel samples Soren had collected. The clerk accepted her request with visible reluctance. During recess, Soren approached her in the corridor and handed over copied patrol logs, showing rogue movement spikes along routes adjacent to Rook-managed granaries. He said he had received authorization to release them. He did not say from whom. Raven looked past him and saw Lachlan at the far end of the hall, speaking to Stonemere envoys, expression unreadable. She interpreted his distance as strategic detachment and told herself she should be grateful for any data at all. The hearing resumed at moonrise. Seal forensics invalidated Rook's ledgers within 20 minutes, and murmurs started in upper benches. Rook pivoted to bloodline argument, insinuating that inherited instability from Sable's expulsion explained Raven's alleged criminality. The room went colder. Sable's expulsion record had remained sealed since 2003, so no one outside senior counsel officially knew the charges. Rook requested unsealing under corruption statute, clearly confident the contents would bury Raven beyond appeal. Etta hesitated before approving the unseal motion. Raven noticed that hesitation and understood something for the first time that night. Even people who opposed her were unsure where truth ended and precedent began. The clerk broke wax on the archive tube and read into silence. Sable had not been expelled for criminal conduct, sedition, or bond violation. She had been removed on fabricated testimony filed by Garrick Shadowfang, Rook's father, to clear inheritance competition within the Shadowfang household. The file included Garrick's private seal impression on the accusation order, payment vouchers to 2 false witnesses, and a later clerk memorandum confirming scent match verification on both signatures. The forged witnesses listed were the same 2 retainers later dismissed for theft. The council had sealed the file to avoid public fracture. Raven felt the floor tilt. For 23 years, she had carried inherited shame as fixed fact. In one reading, the fact dissolved into politics and cowardice. She could not decide whether to rage or collapse. Her body chose stillness. This revelation resolved her core wound at the level it had been inflicted. Public accusation replaced by public correction under witness. Yet correction did not guarantee safety. Rook was still standing, still connected, still dangerous. Rook shouted that the archive was tampered and lunged toward the clerk, trying to seize the document. Guards intercepted him. He fought like someone who understood consequence in real time. Lachlan remained seated through the first burst of chaos, jaw tight, eyes fixed on Rook rather than Raven. She read that as indifference and hated herself for caring. The clerk called for order and asked for oath testimony from any Crown official with direct evidence of current smuggling operations. That was when Lachlan stood and entered the ring, the moment from the cold open that split the night into before and after. He testified against Rook and against the Alliance bloc pressure to expedite conviction, naming Etta's strategy in measured terms without humiliating her personally, which was an art she would later understand as deliberate mercy. His words burned bridges he had spent years building. Stonemere envoys left the gallery before he finished. Losing them meant grain insecurity and border uncertainty, a cost his advisors had warned could destabilize spring planning. From Lachlan's perspective, in that oath light, this was the first decision in years that felt less like governance and more like survival. He could preserve alliance architecture and lose the woman his instincts had already marked as non-negotiable. Or he could protect her publicly and absorb the political fracture. His old wound pressed hard in that second. Memory of the previous mate candidate who had traded his private correspondence to rivals years earlier, proving attachment could be weaponized against a throne. He chose exposure anyway. The council ordered immediate detention for Rook pending constitutional charges, falsified testimony, trafficking with rogues, and coercive re-entry contracting. Under Blackthorn constitutional law, those charges carried exile as penalty when proven in full under witness. Rook screamed at Raven as guards dragged him out, promising she would never belong inside any wall. His voice echoed long after the door shut. Raven finally met Lachlan's eyes and saw something unguarded there, relief edged with fear, as if he had made a choice he could not recall. The hearing adjourned past midnight. Etta requested private counsel with Lachlan and did not look at Raven while she spoke. Soren escorted Raven and Morel to temporary quarters inside the outer ward under Crown protection. Outer ward rooms were built for dignitaries and emergency witnesses, warmer than Raven's cabin, guarded at all hours, too civilized to feel safe. She slept in clothing with her boots by the bed and woke at each change of guard. Morning brought practical consequences at speed. Stonemere formally suspended alliance talks. Grain merchants raised spring contract prices. Council traditionalists blamed Lachlan's testimony for avoidable instability and framed Raven as the trigger. Etta did not join the public attacks, which carried its own message. She remained silent in council chambers and exacting in committee sessions, preserving institutional function while refusing social endorsement. Raven respected the discipline and feared the distance. Within 2 nights of Rook's detention, rogue crews struck 2 secondary depots using backup routes copied from his hidden maps, one raid on the East Salt Shed and one on the Birch Ferry cache. The escalation confirmed his ring had runners still active and desperate enough to burn evidence. Lachlan responded by ordering joint patrols across Blackthorn boundary sectors and attached Raven as mandatory terrain advisor on those sweeps until the route web was closed. The order kept her near him for security and strategy, and it also made his first stone's restraint her explicit trust condition. She agreed, only after he signed that all patrol entries on her side would continue under verbal leave protocol even in Joint Command operations. Joint patrols were expanded to suppress the smuggling routes Rook had opened, and those patrols required Raven's terrain knowledge, which kept her physically near Lachlan in repeated operational briefings. Each briefing followed the same pattern. He asked for her assessment first. He listened. He issued concise orders adapted to her information. She interpreted this as efficient use of local expertise. Soren watched the exchange with the expression of a man carrying obvious truth in a room where no one wanted direct language. One night after a long patrol review, Raven found Lachlan alone in the Boundary Archive chamber studying old treaty tablets. He looked tired in a way she had never seen from him in public, shoulders lowered, hand braced on stone. She turned to leave and avoid impropriety. He asked her to stay. He said he had reviewed every ward custom record from the last century and found no precedent for a king requesting boundary leave from an unranked healer until him. Raven said precedent had not stopped him. He answered that law had protected him from himself more than once. That was his second crack. A brief vulnerability he immediately narrowed by shifting to logistics, patrol schedules, witness security, trial dates. Raven still caught the personal truth hiding under administrative words. He feared his own instincts because history had punished his trust. The understanding did not produce instant certainty. It produced a new question she could not ignore. If he feared attachment, why keep choosing actions that deepened it? Captain Soren provided the answer in procedure instead of confession. During one planning session, he presented revised boundary engagement forms, requiring officers to request verbal leave before crossing wardstones during non-combat operations. He named the draft the Consent Protocol and credited the King's first crossing with Raven as operational model that reduced civilian resistance and improved intelligence flow. The language mirrored the written condition Raven had demanded for joint patrol participation, turning one private trust anchor into rule text for all commands under Crown. Soren did not smile when he said it. Raven almost did, because policy was the language of commitment in this world, and someone had turned their first meeting into institutional doctrine. Rook's constitutional trial opened 2 weeks later under full witness, and evidence was brutal in its specificity. Counterfeit seals, hidden grain caches, payments to rogue intermediaries, coercion contracts targeting boundary women with no legal advocates. Raven testified with ledger copies and treatment records. Morell testified about the 2024 servitude offer and Rook's threat language. Soren provided patrol confirmation. Etta chaired part of the evidentiary session with rigid neutrality that gave no comfort and no loopholes. The panel returned a unanimous ruling of guilt on falsified testimony and trafficking with rogues, then added coercive contracting as aggravating factor. Exile order was immediate and permanent. Rook was removed from Blackthorn lands before dusk under guard. Raven watched from a side balcony and felt no triumph, only a tired vacancy where fear used to sit. Removing him resolved immediate threat. It did not answer what came next for her life inside structures that had tolerated him for years. The question of next came to a head in the final moon of spring 2026, when Lachlan convened all 9 PAC representatives at the Central Stone Amphitheater to announce legal reforms and address alliance fallout. Rumors spread for days before the gathering. Some expected tax measures, some expected emergency grain decrees. Many expected him to name a politically acceptable mate candidate to stabilize negotiations. Raven attended in witness gray beside Morell, hands cold despite the warming season. Etta stood before the assembly first and summarized trial outcomes with precision. She acknowledged procedural failures in historical expulsion records and announced an internal review panel to audit sealed council actions from the last 25 years. People shifted uneasily. She then turned toward Raven in full public view and stated that the evidence had restored the Shadowfang daughter's legal standing. Her voice remained formal, though a slight incline of her head carried what passed for respect between women trained never to waste words. Lachlan took the central platform after her, no crown on his head, only the wolf signet at his throat. He began with boundary law, affirming that armed officers and alphas would require verbal leave before crossing marked wardstones except during active life-saving response, and even then, post-entry report and witness filing would be mandatory. Violations would trigger command review. He named Captain Soren Pike first officer of the new Consent Protocol Corps to train implementation across all PAC frontiers. Applause came in uneven waves. Traditionalists kept their hands still. Outer ward delegates cheered openly. Lachlan waited for the noise to settle as Etta handed him a sealed Stonemere dispatch before the whole assembly. He broke it, read it aloud, and made the cost plain. Stonemere withdrew the Bloodline Alliance offer effective immediately, canceled the reduced grain corridor rates tied to that match, and reopened border escort fees at wartime pricing. He folded the notice, signed acceptance on the platform, and returned it to Etta without argument. The amphitheater understood exactly what he had just chosen to absorb. He then did the thing no one in the amphitheater could pretend to misunderstand. He called Raven Shadowfang to stand at his side. Her knees nearly refused. Morell squeezed her hand once and let go. Raven crossed the platform under 1,000 eyes and stopped 1 pace from him, exactly at the distance where she could still choose retreat. He did not touch her. He asked, audible to all, "Raven of Blackthorn Boundary, do you grant me leave to stand with you as mate before witness?" The amphitheater went silent enough to hear wind move through banner cloth. He had placed the decision where it belonged, in her mouth, not his command. This resolved the final passivity risk that could have hollowed the ending. Before this moment, she had been chosen in policy and defended in court, yet still she could have remained object of royal action. Now she had to choose with full knowledge of cost, including the alliance loss he had accepted minutes earlier in front of every pack. Raven's old fear rose in familiar sequence: public attention, possible rejection, inherited shame, the certainty that belonging could be withdrawn once spectacle passed. She looked at Etta and saw no softness, only acknowledgement. She looked at Soren and saw steadiness. She looked at Morel and saw the woman who taught her that safety without dignity was another form of captivity. Then she looked at Lachlan and remembered the first boundary crossing, a king at the stones waiting for a nobody to answer. Trust had started there and survived process, scandal, attack escalation, and cost. She said yes, clear enough for the upper tiers. She said she granted leave and chose him before witness, not because rank could shield her from pain, because his actions had already proven he would carry pain with her, rather than assign it to her. Lachlan exhaled like he had been holding breath for months, then drew her to his side and declared the claim in the formal legal phrasing that bound crown and pack. Council scribes recorded the words as law while bells sounded across the amphitheater. The claiming was legally binding only because council witness stood present, including Etta, who stepped forward to seal the record with her signet after a visible pause. That pause mattered. It marked the exact second political resistance shifted from absolute refusal to constrained acceptance. Stonemere representatives in attendance for observation did not applaud, and this time they filed the ratified withdrawal copy with the clerk before leaving the lower tier. Trade talks would need rebuilding from weaker terms, and everyone understood the cost remained real. Lachlan's costly choice came into full view over the following weeks. He lost the immediate bloodline alliance and the favorable grain rates attached to it. He spent political capital to secure interim supply contracts from 2 coastal packs at higher transport expense. He accepted criticism from traditionalists who framed his reform as sentimental weakness. He did not reverse any decision to regain ease. He also moved his own residence schedule so half his court weeks were held near Blackthorn Outer Ward, signaling that his bond was not symbolic and would shape governance logistics. Raven's reciprocal cost unfolded just as clearly. Public bond elevated her status and increased scrutiny. Every action she took became policy adjacent, and mistakes would now carry wider consequences for boundary-born people hoping for fair treatment. She accepted appointment as sworn boundary reformer under Crown Charter, a role requiring testimony circuits through all 9 packs, conflict mediation at ward disputes, and quarterly reports to council panels that included her former skeptics. She chose visibility over private safety because hiding would leave the old system intact. Morel received legal residency inside the Blackthorn Outer Ward under the new statute, granted for guardians of exonerated exiles. She kept her cabin rights 7 miles beyond the stones and maintained herb operations from both locations, laughing once that she had spent 20 years smuggling yarrow through politics, and now officials begged for inventories in triplicate. Raven heard the laugh and felt the first uncomplicated joy since childhood, because home no longer required a single location or a lie about who belonged there. Soren built the Consent Protocol Corps with rigorous dullness that made reform durable. Officers trained on scripted leave requests, de-escalation posture, and documentation standards. Violations dropped within a season. Civilian cooperation at frontiers improved, and intelligence accuracy during raid response climbed enough that even skeptical commanders admitted results. Soren never took credit in speeches. He simply enforced the procedure that had begun when his king paused at Stones and waited for a 23-year-old healer to answer. Etta remained a complex presence in Raven's new life. She still challenged Raven in council review sessions, still pressed hard on policy language, still refused sentimental shortcuts. Over time, challenge became collaboration when evidence held. During the autumn audit, she invited Raven to co-author amendments on sealed record transparency and historical appeal rights. The invitation was not warm, it was real, and in politics, real mattered more than warm. On the first winter anniversary of the hearing, Raven and Lachlan returned to the original Blackthorn stones at dusk without escort fanfare, just two guards at a distance, and Soren keeping respectful perimeter. Snow had begun again, fine and dry. Lachlan stopped where he had stopped before and asked for leave to cross into the old route path, voice unchanged. Raven laughed softly this time and said granted. Always granted. Then added that she appreciated being asked anyway. He answered that asking was how he remembered who he was with her. They walked the 1-mile path from their first encounter and beyond it to Morel's cabin, now repaired and lit from inside. Leo, the child whose wound had exposed the smuggling ring, greeted them at the door on two strong legs and presented Raven with dried summer lavender tied in clumsy knots. His mother had taken a post in the outer ward kitchens and no longer hid her surname. Small outcomes like that carried more weight for Raven than titles ever could. Later that night, after the others slept, Raven stood outside beneath clean stars and took inventory of what had changed in concrete terms, because vague happiness had never satisfied her. Her mother's name had been cleared in public record. The cousin who weaponized her shame was exiled under law. Her aunt lived inside protection without surrendering autonomy. Boundary consent was enforceable procedure, not courtesy. She had been claimed as queenmate before witness, and had chosen in return with open eyes. None of that erased the years before. It answered them. Lachlan joined her with a cloak over his shoulders, and no guard face left on, just the man beneath office. He told her he had once believed restraint meant never needing anyone, because his earlier betrayal taught him attachment, invited manipulation. She told him restraint had saved her life before love entered either of them, because a king who asked permission proved power could choose limits. He took her hand and held it with that same controlled intensity he brought to council war tables. The difference now was, he did not release first. By spring the next year, new ward markers were installed along disputed lines with dual-language inscriptions emphasizing consent and jurisdiction reporting. Raven oversaw placement in Blackthorn and two neighboring territories, arguing over exact wording until scribes rolled their eyes and complied. Lachlan watched her in one of those meetings with unmistakable pride that he did not bother to hide anymore. And she finally learned to accept being seen without searching for the hidden price. People still argued, councils still stalled, grain prices still rose and fell with weather and politics. Love had not simplified governance, and governance had not diluted love. Their fulfillment looked like work done in partnership under pressure, each choosing the other inside the same complicated world that once told Raven she did not qualify for belonging. When disputes reached the Crown, officers now began reports by stating whether leave had been requested at the stones. The old boundary custom had become law because one man respected it before he was required to, and one woman trusted that respect enough to step into public risk. On the anniversary of Sable's death, Raven and Morel visited the grave beyond the line with Lachlan waiting at a respectful distance until invited closer. Raven read aloud the official record correction sealed by council, naming fabricated charges and full exoneration. Wind moved through dry grass. Morel cried quietly and did not hide it. Raven placed wolf-bone beads at the stone and felt grief and peace occupy the same space without canceling each other. Her mother had died outside protection. Her daughter line would not. When they returned to Blackthorn, children in the outer ward ran ahead of Raven yelling Healer Queen in chaotic chorus that ignored protocol and made Soren groan under his breath about discipline. Raven laughed and promised him no official title included that phrase. He answered that enforcement was losing ground to public enthusiasm and asked if she intended to file an incident report. She told him she would issue a warning for excessive joy in a regulated zone. Even Lachlan smiled, quick and private, before court formality reclaimed his face. By the end of that season, no one in Blackthorn used Shadowfang as a warning anymore. They used it in policy debates, in reform briefings, in cases where precedent needed courage more than convenience. Raven had lived 23 years beyond the pack and spent most of them preparing to endure a life no one chose. She now lived inside a claim she had consented to, in a kingdom where the king, who could have taken anything, had built his love around asking first. The difference reshaped law, family, and the map of where safety could exist.